your license is active?
Yes, it is.
How many more years until you have to renew?
Oh, I just renewed it in let's see, in April, March or April. But
And
I
how,
haven't gone in for the DOT physical exam because I wanted to go to the cardiologist and get all that stuff out of the way, before going in for the exam. And I've got to drive to Houston to do it. Nobody over here in Beaumont. That's the nearest big town or bigger town than where I'm living. I'm living in a little Piney Woods, East Texas town that's north of Beaumont.
and how long has it been since you've been in the wheel, physically been in the wheelhouse?
Oh, it's been 4.5 years now.
We'll work our way up to that point. But your career began in 1973, and I believe you said in 1970, at 10 years old, you got a license. So born in 1960, tell me about that first decade of your life prior to getting this motorcycle license.
Actually, I was born in 1955.
Okay.
Okay. And so when I turned 15, I got a motorcycle license, and that enabled me to take a job as a lifeguard. And at the pool where I worked, the hotel maintenance man asked me the first day I was on the job if I wanted to make some quick money that night. So, of course, I did. And he hired me as a line handler for his mooring company. We moored ships in the Port of Beaumont and Port Arthur and occasionally in Orange. And so that was my first experience working on the water. And so we just handled lines, mooring ships, letting them go when they were ready to sail. And when I got out of high school, I had a falling out with my stepfather, who was a veterinarian, and so he decided that he wasn't going to send me to Texas A&M to become a veterinarian. And anyhow, I just went down to some of the docks there on the Neches River and went around and knocked on doors on the boats until I found a captain that was encouraging enough to give me the port captain's name and telephone number for Houston Barge Lines. And I drove to Houston. By that time, I was, old enough to have a driver's license. I drove to Houston in an actual car and applied for the job. Port captain's name was Bill Walters. That was for Houston Barge Lines, and he took me to Burton Shipyard, where I caught the Captain T.M. Norsworthy. And that was my first boat to work on. Then I worked on another boat called the Lita Jane. And after a while, I quit and went back ashore, thinking that, I was missing my girlfriend, and I wanted to have a shore job. She wanted that too. And so I tried my hand at that. Didn't work out. I missed the water by that time. The saying at the time that I started on the boats was that once you get that diesel smoke in your nose, you're ruined for anything else. And so I sure enough was ruined for anything like that. So anyhow, I was living at the beach, and I saw a flyer for it was Galveston College, but the program, the associate's degree program in oceanic and marine technology, was being offered by Brazosport College. And the man who was the superintendent of that department was named John Gunning. and he later became a Freeport pilot. And so he was an old Texas A&M University Galveston graduate. And my actual instructor was a fellow by the name of John Hughes, who had just retired from the Coast Guard. He was captain on two buoy tenders, diesel electric buoy tenders. One was the Gentian, and then they would alternate him to the Blackthorn, another one. The Blackthorn, many years later, was sunk, and I think all hands except for one died over in Tampa Bay. But anyhow, he was a great instructor. He was a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut, and was from the state of Maine. Really good guy. But I only was able to stay for 1 year because my mother died, and I was named the executor of her estate. So I went back and took care of that business, and then worked as often as I could as an unlicensed mate on offshore supply vessels. At that time, I was being paid $75 a day. And I had a merchant mariner's document that showed me as a food handler, wiper, and deckhand. Ordinary seaman, they called me. And anyhow, all the entry-level positions in every department. And so that, in addition to that, I had a third-class radio telephone operator's license from the FCC. These two pieces of paper were what I was issued by simply applying for them under the aegis of Galveston College. And so that was also 2 more pieces of paper than anyone in the crew of those supply boats actually had themselves. So I was referred to as the educated guy. And anyway, I was able to do chart navigation, whereas they weren't. They just looked out the window and decided to go left or right. That's how they operated. And so once I finished up with that, the way I finished up, my car wouldn't go anymore. It quit over in Lake Charles or down on the way to Cameron, Louisiana. And so I really needed a way to get to work. And a friend of mine, a neighborhood guy, worked for Sabine Towing Company, and they were affiliated with the Seafarers Union. So anyhow, I joined the union in the port of Port Arthur. I joined the Seafarers Union because they found me a job. I didn't have to drive all over the country looking for a job. And so that's when I went to work for Higman Barge Lines in Orange, Texas. And so I worked for them as a deckhand, and they told me right up front, they said, if you still don't have a tankerman ticket in 90 days, don't bother to come back. We don't need deckhands, we need tankermen. And I said, well, you told me how long the maximum time without a tankerman ticket is. What's the minimum time? He said 30 days on board. So I went out for my first hitch, and sure enough, they asked me to ride over. I said, I'll ride over under the condition that I can get my full 30 days. And they said, no problem. So I rode to, I think it was 32 days, came back in, asked for the letter so that I could go to the Coast Guard and get my tankerman ticket. And I didn't really prepare for the test except to read the manual, the introductory manual that was sitting in the waiting room at the exam center in the port of Port Arthur. And so while I was waiting, I boned up for the test, and I went in and aced it. And apparently that was the first time that had ever happened at Higman Towing Company. So, anyhow, they were happy with me, and they made me a promise then and there that if I kept my nose clean in a year, they'd send me to license prep school, which, I didn't think I really needed that, but why not? They were paying for it. And so I got my license, my original, it was a second class. They called it a second class operator, uninspected towing vessels at that time. That was back in 1979. And so when I received that license, it was understood that I'd have to work a year before I could upgrade. And when I got the upgraded license, all they did was they removed the second class restriction. It just said operator uninspected towing vessel instead of second class operator. That was what in effect was the master position now. When they changed them from uninspected towing vessels, they just converted the second class to mate and the general class to master. And so that's the way that evolved. And so I continued to work there for quite some time. And then I got married, and my wife wanted me to be around the house on a little bit shorter interval. So I took a job with another union company in order to keep my benefits. I went to work for G&H Towing Company, which operated 4 different companies, harbor tugs, for ship assist work in the ports of Galveston, Texas City, and Houston. And I worked for them from 95 through 97. And when I left there, I did a short stint on the Texas Responder oil spill vessel that was at that time moored at Pelican Island, not far from G&H's office. So it was very convenient. I was living in Friendswood, Texas at the time, only about 45 minutes drive from there. And so that was a pretty good sized vessel. I think it was 500 something tons. And so from there, I moved on. I had been working for those companies. They were union companies, but I was under a contract for non-licensed personnel. And so I knew that if I wanted to get credit for my sea time towards my pension, which was significantly higher than the unlicensed pension, that I'd better get back over to Higman and finish up my union time there. And that's exactly what I did. I stayed there long enough to have 20 years of accreditation with the union in order to nail down my pension. And so anyway, after I left there, I think I went to work for Blessey Marine Service in Harahan, Louisiana. And I stayed there for right at a year. And then moved on to some bigger vessels. One of them was the Dewey R, which at that time was being managed by Inland Marine Service. It's an old Apex boat, and we still dealt with the fellow that was the manager of Apex Oil Company. And we were on a regular run from Mount Airy with a 3-piece oil tow. We would load there at Mount Airy, run up to Joliet, discharge the mobile dock there, and then run up no, I've got it wrong. we would go to Forest View and discharge, and then come back down through Joliet, through all the bridges, and reload at Mobile Joliet with the 3-piece. We had loads going both directions. The only time we were empty was going through the bridges there at Joliet. And so then we'd go down to Mount Airy, discharge, and reload without ever breaking the hose. Dock hose stayed connected. So I did that for about a year, and then moved on to golly, I think I went directly from there to Southern Towing Company in Memphis. They hired me over the phone. It was another 3 years before I actually met Bobby Jones, who was the personnel director at that time. I didn't know anyone in the office except by their voice over the telephone for the first 3 years. So really very laid back, the way that business was conducted in those days. And so after that, I just became a trip pilot, just working for anyone. The phone would ring. I determined that I would never say no to anything, and as long as it was reasonable, because I wanted the phone to keep ringing, and so I never turned down anything as long as it was fairly reasonable. And so I had a variety of jobs, and I learned most all the rivers. I was before I left Higman, I learned they opened up a new run. One of their main customers was Amoco, and Amoco had a dock in Decatur, Alabama. It's now owned by British Petroleum. They bought Amoco. And so when we first started, that was in the old Amoco days. So we would load paraxylene in Texas City and take it to Amoco Decatur, discharge, and then reload with regular xylene, take that down to Texas City and let them further refine it to paraxylene. And this was, a regular run, always with loads, same as that run that I was making up to Forest View in Joliet, Illinois. So it was a regular kind of a nice routine. I really enjoy routine. And so I stayed with that for as long as I could. But eventually I started working for Martin Gas Marine, and I worked for them on a boat that was running asphalt from Marathon Garyville to Marathon Port Sutton. Now, Port Sutton, Garyville, of course, is right there between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Port Sutton is in the far reaches of Tampa Bay. So we would discharge that asphalt at Port Sutton at the other Marathon dock there. And then we would return, and I had enough trips and enough experience from working at the Shell oil facility in Southwest Pass years before that we didn't have to take state pilots when we entered Southwest Pass. From the sea buoy on up to Marathon Garyville, we operated the vessel without a state pilot. And it was the same way when we returned to Tampa Bay. We never had to use state pilots. So we saved the company quite a bit of money, and they paid us a small amount to, as a kind of a gratuity, I guess. And it helped to supplement my income. And so I was grateful for that. I went to work for Crowley on their invader class tugs. I was on the tug Ensign, running from Lake Charles to San Juan, Puerto Rico, with a triple deck container barge. These were the biggest boats that they had. They were built at McDermott Shipyard in 1978, most all of them. And they never had one of them sink. And so I really liked those boats. 138 foot long, 7,200 horsepower. Each of them was equipped with two 20-cylinder 645 EMDs. And so it was a real pleasure to operate those boats and haul down to San Juan. And every second trip, we would depart San Juan and go to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and reload or swap. What you're actually doing is offloading some trailer barges. I mean, some of these trailers, they were like containers that were hauled behind a truck or loaded onto flatbed cars on the railroad. And so we would offload some of them and reload some others, and then go back to Lake Charles. And so I always enjoyed that kind of experience. It really helped me to fill in the gaps in my knowledge that not completing the second year of my associate's degree, I felt like that was my way of completing the education that I missed in the classroom. And so I was always eager for new experiences. And of course, I didn't mention this before, but when I was working for G&H Towing Company, one of their divisions, Suderman and Young, was actually owned by some Admiralty lawyers, Royston Razor Associates. And so when we had captains' meetings, they would dispatch one of their Admiralty lawyers to lecture us. And typically, this fellow would let us know that today we're going to discuss Rule 2. And, he would tell us to take notes because there was going to be a test, conduct between vessels. He could carry on all day long on the subject. And so, I got a pretty well-rounded informal education with all these people. And I decided that I wanted to upgrade my license to higher tonnage. And so I signed up for a bridge resource management course with Marine Safety International and went to their school, which was situated on the campus of Kings Point at the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York. So I went up there and did a 10-day course in bridge resource management that was being taught by a retired Navy Rear Admiral. And my classmates were both officers from Maritime Overseas Corporation's foreign fleet. They were in the business of running very large crude carriers into Port of Valdez, Alaska. And this was in 1989. So it was about 3 years after the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And so these guys, one of them was from Genoa, Italy, the other one from Split, Croatia. And they were really good classmates. They were, I learned a lot from them and from the retired admiral and the course material in general. And I got credit for 10 days sea time for every day that I spent in that classroom. And so that was all large hull experience, unlimited tonnage. And so that helped me to continue to upgrade my license and the scope of operations. So I got the near coastal endorsement, went and took the standards for training, certification, and watch keeping. STCW was required for not the license necessarily, but to actually work on those vessels that required that license, near coastal. And so I did that, and then I worked on. I threw my name in the hat, still wanting to add to my time with the licensed union pension. I threw in for a job on a maritime administration owned ship that was doing war games, participating in war games in South Korea, in Pohang Hang. And it was called a OPDS ship, offshore petroleum discharge system. It had a dozen hose reels mounted on the deck, and we assembled these hose sections as needed to discharge jet fuel or water, whatever was needed ashore. The idea was for us to provide this fuel and water as war material for an invasion of an unimproved beachhead. And so we had the depth of water, which was ascertained by the CIA. They'd send a SEAL team in on board a submarine and gauge all this stuff. So we assembled the anchor chain on top of the single anchor leg mooring associated with this ship for that depth of water. So that jewelry, as they called it, was just at the exact right length to support the buoy that sat atop the single anchor leg mooring. And that's where we connected our discharge hose, and it went through a swivel on that barge and connected to the shore hoses, and ultimately to a tank farm that was made of Mylar bags. So they called it a bag farm. The construction battalions, the Navy Seabees, were busy building berms and establishing that bag farm ashore while we were assembling all the hoses and setting up to discharge our cargo to them. And so it was a pretty interesting operation, which was required some instruction, which was done again by a retired admiral, Admiral Per Pearson, who worked for a company called SAIC. And I was told that their budget was classified. Nobody knew what their budget was, except for the CIA, or maybe just the director of the CIA. Anyway, we stayed in San Francisco Harbor while they were refurbishing this old steamship that was built in 1963. Its name was Chesapeake, and it was operated by Bay Ship Management out of New Jersey. And they had us there getting a new certificate of inspection. So we had to satisfy the Coast Guard that this ship was seaworthy. We did a number of sea trials and failed all of them but the fifth and final sea trial. And when we got this certificate of inspection, it was for 39 crew members, most of whom were naval They were sailors from the Navy. And then we had a boatswain's mate that was in charge of those men, and a few Marines, just a handful of Marines who were in the underwater completion team. So that was really very enjoyable, learning all the physics involved and how that whole thing was to be worked off. And I guess I was the only one that really displayed any interest in it. But I was asking questions, and I was very much awake while everybody else was napping. And that was the first half of every day. And so I got pretty well acquainted with Admiral Pearson. And so then once we finished that trip, I moved on to a diesel ship, a diesel powered ship that was participating in the summer of 1994's Haitian invasion. Baby Doc Duvalier was causing trouble down there, and George Bush was unwilling to put up with his nonsense. So we were set up to do unreps, and which meant we were going to be refueling and resupplying the ships that were involved in the invasion. We went down there, and it amounted to nothing more than saber rattling, because Baby Doc was convinced that we meant business. And so we didn't actually have to go through any of that stuff for real. We just pulled into Guantanamo Bay and tied up at Gitmo for a couple of weeks, and then returned to the States and made a few runs up the East Coast, delivering jet fuel from Houston to Norfolk and various points up in the East Coast, Pax River Naval Air Base, and a number of other destinations that regularly use that kind of fuel. And so these are just some of the highlights, and I wound up returning to Southern Towing Company and working a 28 and 28 schedule. And I really felt like I was underutilized because of the schedule, but I liked working with my counterpart who was on the same schedule. We caught the boat together, we got off together. And so I didn't want to interrupt that. I didn't want to upset that kind of a situation, because I really liked working with this guy. When you find somebody that works the way you do, it's kind of a rare thing. And so I took a job moonlighting with Florida Marine Transporters out of Mandeville, and then worked for them for as much as I could without interfering with my main job with Southern Towing Company. And so the CEO of Southern Towing Company was a man named Ed Grimm, with whom I'd worked before at Martin. And he found out that I was working at Florida Marine. I made no secret of it. I figured my time was my own. And anyway, I don't know if he got upset with that or if it was just an excuse to separate me and the other captain I was working with on the golly, now I can't remember which boat it was. It was one of the Baxter boats anyway. But we were hauling 3 anhydrous ammonia barges at that time up to all points in the Midwest, all up the Ohio River, the upper Mississippi, the Illinois. We did a lot of work in the Illinois River. But anyhow, that was that was the end of my days with Southern Towing Company. So I'd had such a good experience with Florida Marine Transporters that I just continued with them until I got sick and couldn't work anymore. This prostate cancer metastasized on me, and I guess I was guilty of neglecting myself to the point where it metastasized and it got into my T9 vertebral structure, and the mass that was within that T9 grew to the point where it shattered that whole T9 vertebral structure. And when that happens, it's very, very painful. So that got my attention. I went to the doctor and I was diagnosed, and it was too late to have my prostate removed. So I just had to endure the testosterone blockers and the prednisone and all those other nasty drugs. And finally, I didn't die as they predicted I would. They said I would live for 3 to 5 years, and that time passed, and I was feeling a lot better. I still was kind of suffering because of the drugs. The treatment was worse than the disease at that point. So I went to MD Anderson, and they took me off all those drugs. And I'm going back on the 21st, which what's that, about 8 days from now. And I'm going to start testosterone replacement therapy. And I'm hoping that it'll help me to regain enough strength in my legs that going up and down the stairs, well, down is easy. Going up the stairs, 6 flights of stairs on some of the vessels is kind of a chore, if you do it twice a day. And so I really don't want to go out and embarrass myself my first crack at working again after so long away. So I just want to make sure that I can do the job. That's it.
And how's recovery been? I mean, have you beat the cancer?
Well, so far it's in remission. And what happened when they took the biopsy of the one that was in my spine, they confirmed that it was cancer, but it was dead. It had been starved of blood because it used all the available blood and then just died off. And so, I'm just hoping for the best. I'll know more when I talk to the oncologist at MD Anderson on the 21st. I'm supposed to be there at 7:15 in the morning, and I've got the blood tests, and I think that's all they're doing is just a blood test, and then a consultation at 9. That'll give them time to do the blood work. And this guy's really, I'm really impressed with him, but that will mark, the June 21st will mark 1 year from the day that I first went there and saw him. His name is John Arujo, Araujo. And he's from New York, from Long Island. And so I've been up there. I've been up there for bridge management. And I've been to bridge management also at Delgado Community College in New Orleans on 3 different occasions, and then to the Union School at Piney Point, Maryland, and did bridge management up there about 3 or 4 times too. So I've been around doing that, and anyway, I'll know more about this cancer situation after the 21st, and so I'm very hopeful. He asked me the last time, he said, why aren't you at work? And I'm going to tell him this time, that I just don't want to embarrass myself by going to work before I know for certain that I can manage to get up and down the stairs. And so that's really my only concern at this point. Uh, I just I'm very, very eager to go back to work, but I really don't want to go out and just embarrass myself, for my lack of strength and endurance.
Well, I'm glad to see you on this side of things with this illness, and wish you all the best, of course, next week at that appointment. But do you have time for a few more questions?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Well, let's dial back to the beginning of your career, 1973, Houston Barge Line.
Yes.
Fill me in on the process, I guess, orientation and training, getting on board, what that job was.
Well, the job was in those days, uh, they were carrying a 9-man crew. And so I was really just a galley hand. That was an entry level position at that time. So they had me cleaning up the galley and trying to have everything spick and span for the cook when he came in around 4 o'clock to cook breakfast. And so the very first day that I was on the boat, uh, they didn't give me any orientation. There was no formal training of any kind in those days. I'm sure that whatever training I might have received, I would have already been well prepared for it, because working as a line handler for Nature's Mooring Service was more than adequate preparation. And so when the captain was relieved at midnight that night, he came down and he said, "Well, I see you got yourself a new career." And I said, "Well, yes, so far so good, and I think I can do this job." And that was about the extent of it. It was an easy job. Everything that I ever tried to do on boats came very easily to me. But part of that was the fact that my stepfather was a pretty serious taskmaster. He was in the Corps of Cadets at Texas A&M when he was training to be a veterinarian. And before he could graduate, they called him in. He had a commission. He went into the Army as a lieutenant and served as a tank commander under General Patton. And his very first taste of wintertime battle was in the Battle of the Bulge. So he was a pretty tough character. And I don't know what he went through during that war, but he was pretty tough on me. And so I worked at his animal clinic. He was a small animal veterinarian for the most part. And so there was not a single job that needed to be done that I wasn't assigned to do in that job, working at his animal clinic. And so I didn't, I never said, no, I can't do that. That would have been an ass whipping to me. That's just all there was to it. And so anything that it looked like I was too squeamish to tackle, he bred that out of me. And so I did everything from mowing the grass to sweeping and mopping, and shampooing dogs, holding dogs for x-ray, for examination, for any number of things. And that's just the way it went. I buried dogs that died in the cemetery next to the clinic. Everything that I was asked to do, I did, and I was asked to do just about everything. And so by the time I got to work on boats, I wasn't afraid to do anything. I was just if I didn't understand how to do it, well, I learned. I taught myself. That's just the way it was back then. Nobody had any formal. We didn't have captains meetings until I think it was in 1987, something like that. And I remember when we were first told that we would be required to have random drug screens. And this port captain, nowadays, it would have been the death of this guy's job. But he stood up there in front of the entire company and told all the attendant captains, relief captains, and pilots that if you're dirty, if you have been taking drugs of any kind, then you just let me know, and I'll go back there and talk to the computer and tell it to spit out another name. But if you don't, and you turn in a dirty urinalysis, then shame on you. You're gone. And so, I mean, can you imagine a port captain giving that kind of a speech in this time? And all the officers of the company were lined up there. They were all on that stage with him. And so, it's just, these people were winging it big time. They were just learning as they went. And they expected me to also. I guess that was one of my strengths. Nowadays, these young pilot trainees are learning from an electronic chart display and information system. We didn't have that. I remember going to Chicago the first time, and my co-captain called up and he put the port captain on speaker, and he says, "Hey, Captain, neither one of us has ever been to Chicago." And he said, "Don't tell me that. You got an electron." He said, "You got a radar and you got a paper chart. Why are you complaining?" That's all I ever had when I learned how to run the intercoastal waterway in the Mermentau River. So we all had a good laugh over that. And that's just the way it went. And so, I mean, when you got to fly by the seat of your pants and you got to learn what set and drift is in the real world without having a display or relative and true motion vectors displayed as arrows that are numbered with the true or relative course and the speed and the speed over the ground in nautical miles per hour. Well, you gotta put a little bit of thought process into it rather than the way it's handed to these guys on the electronic chart. And so I think it's a real disservice to them, that they're not taxed any further in their own requirement to think on their feet. I sure was, and I'm very thankful that I came up when I did, rather than having all the aids to navigation that make it so easy nowadays. And it's the same way. We didn't have these cell phones. People ask me why I'm not a sports fan. Well, we didn't have ESPN. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have satellite television when I went out there to work for the first time. And you can only muster enthusiasm for sports on so many occasions and so many seasons, before you just completely lose interest when you can't, keep track of it. I remember the first satellite dish I ever saw mounted on a towboat. It was the Joyce Hale, which at that time was owned by the Pillsbury Corporation. And that satellite dish must have been 7 or 8 feet in diameter. I'd never seen anything like that. And then, of course, that was the first time I'd ever seen Poppin' Fresh, the Pillsbury Doughboy, as a stack logo. that was an unusual thing.
Does anything come to mind from your time with Higman and with Blessey?
Oh, golly, lots of stuff, lots and lots and lots of stuff. It was there were a lot of people that were a lot of fun to work with, but I wouldn't want to work with them again. Too many of them were more than half crazy. And we had a captain at Higman that, to my way of thinking, he got away with so much misbehavior that I certainly wouldn't have gotten away with that. I always held myself to a higher standard. This guy looked like that old Western actor, Gabby Hayes. Wore a hat that looked like him and everything. I don't think this guy had enough on the ball to actually intentionally or deliberately mimic that actor. But he was a spitting image of Gabby Hayes. And they did some of the craziest stuff. I mean, these guys, one time they had an air leak in the engine room. And that same guy, that captain, called everybody down in the engine room to listen for this air leak and see if they could find where it was leaking air. And his watch partner, who was the utility man, who was, basically their answer to an engineer, you could see he got this bright idea, and the expression changed on his face. And he's like, I know what I'll do. I'm going to make this job easy for us. Went and shut down the only generator that was working. And they were both, air starter generators. So now, I mean, we're really dead in the water at that point. So the crazy stuff that went on, I'm telling you. And then the port captain said one time, he told one of the guys that had just gotten a license, he said, well, you're not really a full-fledged pilot until you've torn up $600,000 worth of equipment. And they just laughed about that. They don't laugh about it anymore. The crazy stuff that happened. Yeah. And then at Blessey, they just promoted people so fast. And they promoted them, there was this book that was popular way back then. It was called The Peter Principle. And the theory that was set forth in this book was that people will be promoted and promoted and promoted again until they are promoted beyond their level of competence. And I saw so many examples of that. That happened at Blessey. And the general manager, who was promoted by Walter Blessey himself, he gave people assignments based on whether he liked them or not necessarily whether they were capable of the job. And this guy's name was, and he promoted one of his pals, who is now a port captain for another company, or maybe he's still working with Blessey. I can't remember now. I think he is working for Blessey, and he commutes down to the fleet in Houston and does his port captain work there. And but he was sent up to Chicago, and he cut a point, and his return back south, coming down river, he cut one of the points on can't remember if it was the Illinois River or if it was on the upper, but he ran aground, and it was a very expensive incident. And this guy that had promoted him called him in and said, and that was his name. I can't remember his last name, but anyway, he said, how can you do this? And he says, he answered back, he said, well, you're the one that promoted me. I didn't ask to go up there. And so these conversations were typical at that time. I just thought it was, crazy, just crazy. It didn't seem professional to me at all, but that's what was happening.
Well, and finally, you mentioned a few trips of interest to me. I don't believe I've had anybody on that's been to and from Tampa Bay. Tell me about the trips out there.
Oh, that was a lot of fun. I had never worked on a boat that towed a stern, and that was really a challenging thing because we were towing an oil barge that had living quarters on it, and the two tankermen that were in charge of that barge lived aboard the barge. And instead of having a winch with a wire, we had, those Crowley boats, they were triple deck container barges. They were 126 feet wide, 780 feet long, and about 110 feet tall. And this barge that we were towing was a very low profile barge compared with that. And it was, I think it was something like 79 feet wide and about 200 feet long. And it only drew 13 feet of water. So we're towing it on a fiber hawser, just an 8-strand plaited line. And so you had to really be careful. You had to watch your speed. You had to make sure that you didn't put too much shock on that line. Now with the wire, you've got what's called catenary. Catenary, well, it derives from a Latin word, Catenare, which means chain. And what it amounts to is with a 2-inch wire rope, you've got a big belly in that wire. And so that's enough to absorb all the shock of, if your boat doesn't go into the waves that it's going into at the same time as the barge pierces the wave that it's up against, then, you have a continual shock on that line. And that's all absorbed by the weight of that cable. And so the way Tom Crowley had it set up, one of the wires, we had 2 wires that streamed off of a double drum towing winch. And one of them went to the stem of the barge, and it was strictly for towing. It was a single point attachment. And the other went to a chain bridle. And so it was, we kept it just slightly tighter than the single point attachment. That was so that we could steer the barge more quickly. And so anyhow, with that setup, you were very unlikely to ever part a wire used for towing. With the fiber hawser, it was, when they get that big, they measure them by the circumference. And this was, I think, a 22-inch. No, it was more like a 24-inch circumference fiber hawser, 8-strand plaited. And I think it was Amsteel that made them. Anyway, you could part those hawsers pretty easily, and if you weren't paying attention. And so they changed our destination one time. We were coming up, running just offshore in a tropical storm, coming back from Mexico. We'd been down to Tampico and discharged carbon black down there at a tire plant. That carbon black is what they add to the rubber to strengthen it. And So anyway, on our way back, this tropical storm hit, and we were in 70-mile-an-hour winds and running just off the coast of, in the curve of Texas, in the big bend of the Texas coastline. And we were about 25 miles southwest of Freeport when they sent a message over this teletype machine. I forget what it was called. It went by a proprietary name. But anyway, they sent this text message and said, change of orders, proceed to Southwest Pass ASAP. So we were going to be going up the Mississippi River, coming in at Southwest Pass. And I was just trying to balance, keeping enough strain on the wire to keep us from drifting into shore, and not parting I say wire, it was that fiber hawser. And so I sent them back. I said, well, I'm looking at these very expensive instruments, and our timeline is infinite, and our ETA is never. I knew this particular lady that was the dispatcher very well. She was the wife of the port captain, and so I was just kind of pulling her leg a little bit. And she said, "Why is that?" And I said, "Well, we got 70-mile-an-hour winds. We're in a tropical storm." They hadn't even looked at the weather. That was how out of touch Martin Gas Marine was. And so then they expressed panic and all these other emotions. And so I said, "It's all right, really. Deborah, we're doing just fine, but we're going to keep this thing out of danger, and we're just going to rock along here until we see that it's safe, and then we'll proceed at our best speed, and we'll give you updates as we feel needed." And so they were happy with that. But that's the kind of thing. If that hawser ever parted, well, it did one night, and we hit a freak sea off of as we were returning from Tampa. We were northbound and headed up towards Cape Sandbla, or Sandblast, as some of them call it, Sanblas. And anyway, it's kind of shallow up there, and but that's our location, right there at the base of the Panhandle of Florida. And anyway, we hit a really much larger wave than all of them in that series, and it parted the wire. So here we are. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, and we're out chasing this barge, and got our brand new hawser ready to go. Got the guys out on the barge ready to take the messenger line, and it's just all hands on deck, and really pretty rough, but not too terribly bad, because it was just that one freak wave that did it. And the flying fish, there were hundreds of them, and the porpoises were out there making sport of the flying fish. They were out there having a snack in the middle of the night, and these flying fish are flying for their lives. But anyhow, well, that was about 4 hours of intense work just to get back on track, and proceed, and these things, you can be sure that it's going to happen to you, but it's really hard to foresee when or where it's going to happen. And so you just have to be prepared for whatever comes at you.
And finally,
Tampa,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. You were asking about Tampa Bay, and I really, that was a lousy answer. Tampa Bay, though, they've got a vessel traffic system there, and you check in at Egmont Key check in at the buoy there, the sea buoy, and you check in at Egmont Key, and then you check in at the Sunshine Skyway, and it's the most controlled port in the entire country. They have better security there than any other port in the entire country. So you really had to be on your toes. If you gave them an ETA, they meant for you to keep that ETA. And the docks that we called on sometimes there were 3 docks up in the far reaches of the bay that were the busiest 3 docks in the entire system. And so you had to give them an exact ETA. You had to tell them when you were going to finish cargo ops and when you were going to be out of that slip. And so that was an interesting job. We were, all of us, capable of giving accurate, ETFs and all that stuff. And on one occasion, as we backed out of the slip, this was on a different vessel. This was on an ATB called the Orion with the barge Poseidon. It was a boat that was built originally as a single screw steam vessel back during World War I. And then they converted it to a twin screw and put, Fairbanks Morse engines in it. They wore those engines out, and then they put Alcos in it. And so these Alcos ran through Philadelphia gears. And as I was backing this empty barge out of that slip, I had one of the ship docking modules from Vita, the harbor tug company in Tampa Bay, had him alongside. And as I backed out in clutch, just idling and, clutch astern, I got a call on the sound powered phone from the engineer, and he's from Honduras. And he says, "Secure port engine," and I didn't understand him at first. I said, "Say again, Jose." And he says, "Secure port engine." And I said, okay, it's out of gear. What's the matter? "It explode." They had American Bureau of Shipping inspectors come down and inspect those gears for the 3rd year running. And as they had done in the 2 prior years, recommended having them rebuilt. Well, they ignored that advice. And on this occasion, the entire gear exploded, and even the gearbox was destroyed. And anyhow, I filled out the CG 2692, the Coast Guard form for such incidents, and at first I couldn't find one on the vessel, and I had reported it to our office management in LaPorte, and apparently the guy that I was asking for the CG 2692 from was the guy that had neglected to, he had refused the good advice of the ABS to rebuild these gearboxes. And so he was concerned about his job, as rightly he should have been. And so I waited for him to send me, fax me a copy, because, usually you have one copy in the procedure manual. And when you use it, when you need to use it, you make a copy and you always return the copy to the procedure manual. Well, somebody had used it up, the last one, and so we didn't have a copy on board. So I called. That company had a vetting officer. That was his title, vetting officer. But he was in a different office in a different town. And I called him up, and I said, "Lester, I need a CG 2692. I explained everything that had happened. And I told him that St. Petersburg, Coast Guard, St. Petersburg, which is right there in the bay also, had asked for it, and that they wanted it right away. And he said, well, it's a good thing you called me when you did, because I was about to go on vacation, but I'll send it to you right away. And so he faxed a copy to me. I wrote it out very quickly, very succinct description of what had happened. And this was our port gear. And so I wrote that into the incident report, and I faxed it to the Coast Guard inspection office in St. Petersburg, and to this specific officer who had requested it. And I didn't hear anything back from him for a while, but I had actually, I'm getting kind of scrambled on this. It's been so long, but I had sent it to the vetting officer, and he okayed it. He gave his blessing, and he said, yes, I wouldn't change a word of it. That's perfect. Just send it in like that. And so he signed it alongside my signature, and we sent it in. And I waited an hour or so, and I called that guy, and he said, yes, I received it. And so what are you going to do about the starboard side gear? I said, well, it was the port side. And he said, oh, it was the port side this time. What's it going to be next time? He said, let me tell you something. You got a stack of papers on my desk on that vessel right there that you're on. And I'm half inclined to bar that vessel from ever returning here to this port again. And so they were pretty serious guys. And, ordinarily, if it was the company you work for now, I'm sure if they had an office in another port, they would be on speaking terms and probably on a first name basis with all the Coast Guard officials in every office in that region, in the Tampa Bay area at least. But these guys at Martin didn't even bother with that. So all the Coast Guard officials were complete strangers to them. And so I realized how bad a situation it was. And when I got a call back from Rick Bates, the guy that was actually responsible for having those gearboxes rebuilt and had been recommended to do that, by the ABS on 3 consecutive years. He was giving me a lot of attitude. He didn't know what had transpired. He still thought that I didn't have the blank form to fill out. And so he was, laying all this innuendo on me and a lot of attitude. And so I just let him carry on, and then I explained to him what had happened and that it was a done deal, and that, it's already been turned in. It was approved by Lester Fulfer, the vetting officer, and everything is just hunky dory, except that now this whole gearbox is going to have to be replaced. And we've already talked with the guy from Philadelphia Gears, and he says it's probably going to take 9 months to rebuild that gear and to replace the box, because they'll have to cast the box and then machine the gears. They don't keep these things in inventory. It's not something that's on a shelf somewhere. And so this entire boat is going to be idled, possibly for, well, at least 9 months, and so bad news. But it was the worst possible place for it. They were on good terms with the guys in the Sabine office of the Coast Guard in Port Arthur. That's what they call themselves, Sabine Group. And but this guy in St. Petersburg said, I'm about to call over there to Sabine Group and tell them that, if they like what's been going on, then they can darn well keep y'all over there. And so, just a bad situation. But we always try to make the best of it, and if we hadn't taken care of business in the kind of timely manner that we did, and with just a very succinct description, no more than what had to be said, then it would have been a lot worse. But that's just typical of the Tampa Bay area, St. Petersburg and in specific. And then the VTS, vessel traffic system, was run by Tampa Coast Guard itself, you know. And so I went over there on that very occasion and met all the people in the VTS office, and they showed me around, and we developed a very good relationship with them, because I returned to my regular boat, the Martin Spirit, with the Barge Endeavor, and we continued our run from Marathon Garyville to Marathon Port Sutton, and did that for another couple of years. But it didn't, you know, it was just all the officers on that other boat did their dead level best to minimize the damage to their reputations, but it was just a bad scene. And so that's kind of the way it goes, you know, when people don't take care of business. And what I mean by this, taking care of business, is, you know, just doing what any company would do. You got to maintain good relations with the Coast Guard. That's all there is to it. And the same with the American Bureau of Shipping, if that's the regulatory agency that does inspections on your vessels. None of this applies to inland service, but it sure does when you're working blue water vessels in the various blue water ports. So that's about it.
Well, finally, fill me in on that trip from Lake Charles to Puerto Rico.
Oh, Lake Charles to Puerto Rico, that was a great run, because Crowley had been doing that so long that they had tweaked all the areas that they could to cut down the time that it took to accomplish the job of loading and unloading the various trailers that were, you know, that were to be unloaded and reloaded over there. And so when they first started doing that run, I had met several people down there at the Union Hall in the course of doing that work, that they used to lay everyone off. The entire crew got laid off for usually 3 days or longer. And so they were just on the beach. They were just running around San Juan, Puerto Rico, on vacation. And at that time, those guys were really salty dogs. You know, they didn't want to go home. They just stayed on the beach there, and there was no rotation. The crew that was on the boat stayed on the boat unless they were laid off in Puerto Rico, and then they spent most of their time. What they did, Crowley had a really tight knit group of people working for them, and I felt privileged to work with those guys. Most of them, you may be too young to remember John Kerry going before Congress and the flack that he got way back in the 80s, but in the 80s and early 90s. But he showed up for an interview in Congress wearing a flight suit, and everybody called him a fraud and a poser and everything else. And he claimed that he had experience in Vietnam running up the Mekong River in what they called a swift boat. And all the people that ran those boats called him a fraud. And sure enough, he was. But there were all the people that worked for, all the captains that worked for Crowley on those invader class boats And the port captain also, at the time that I was working there, were veterans of the Vietnam War and had indeed been on those swift boats. And every one of them would tell you that John Kerry was a fraud. And so they were all really a bunch of consummate professionals, but they could make do without any instruments. They could sail by the quickest possible route and avoid all the weather and still come in at the usual ETA. And I saw examples of that, where all of our electronics were lost, and these guys managed to navigate into the port of San Juan and go alongside the dock. But unlike the way it was in the very beginning, they had refined that system, and they built a specialized ramp that allowed they had some very small tractors that could hitch up to those trailers. And they had ramps that would go up and kind of make a spiral and get off at the various landings on each deck of the barge. And so that enabled them to cut their load and discharge time, or cargo ops, let's call it. It cut their cargo ops from 3 days down to just usually 6 to 8 hours. In fact, in the time it took us to break our tow and go and refuel in San Juan, by the time we finished fueling, they were calling us to come and take that barge away. And so the Crowley was, just a master of efficiency. Tom Crowley was, and then of course Tom Jr. inherited the company when his dad was too old to run it any longer. But these guys, their rig, everything about their rig was as secure as they could possibly make it. They had some very small ratchets. They were probably 1/5 of the size of a regular steamboat ratchet, and they used these things to secure the tow wires in between the Norman pins. They had hydraulic Norman pins that would rise up out of the transom of the tug, and there was a space of about 4 inches in between these Norman pins, and they had steel shoes that were chained down that kept the wire from chafing against the actual transom, the bulwark, the top of the bulwark cap rail. And and so they would use those small ratchets to hold down the wires and keep them from jumping out of the shoes in between those Norman pins, and just a lot of different things. The little keeper on the that little steel piece that turns the ratchet, and that usually you kick it off when you're on a river tow. You kick it off to keep it from getting in a bind. They had holes drilled in these, and they would shove a welding rod through them and take about 3 twists on that welding rod to keep it from coming out, because in a heavy sea it would come out. And then they used a series of about 3 nylon tie wraps to secure it even further. And so everything that they did was like belt and suspenders. But that was the greatest innovation that they ever did, was to build those ramps that had a landing on every deck of that trailer barge. And they had some really big electric ballast pumps so that they could adjust the trim even by a few inches to make it quicker. And so it was basically the same draft, whether it was loaded or in any condition of loading. They kept it at about 6.5 feet of draft, but it was 126 feet wide, and 780 feet long. So the engineer was in charge of all that. And then these trailers, about half of them, actually more than half, were fitted with refrigeration units so that they could keep cargoes that were intended to be cold, perishable goods, foodstuffs and the like, and medicines, keep all that at the proper temperature. And they ran off of propane, and they had thermostats, so they would just start on their own and shut off on their own. And even though we had good security in San Juan, about more than half the time we would return to Lake Charles and we'd have stowaways. It was the same way when with Martin, we'd go down to the Dominican Republic, down to San Pedro de Macorís, and deliver asphalt. You just couldn't keep the stowaways off those barges. And Crowley was adamant about it, that we should do everything we could to keep them from getting on the barges because it's very expensive. They averaged the cost and said it was around $15,000 per stowaway of cost to the company, because usually they were ill by the time that they were discovered in Lake Charles, and they had to rush them to the hospital, rehabilitate them, put them up in a hotel if there was a delay, any further delay in having them repatriated, and they had to pay for their transportation and lodging, all those associated costs. And so I saw where, these guys would come aboard and they're dressed in a pair of shorts, no shoes, no shirt. And they've heard the stories about how close Key West or Miami is from, say, Cuba, or from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. But Puerto Rico to Lake Charles was a 2-week transit. And when I was working for them was in the wintertime of 1997. Or no, it wasn't. It was 98. I'm sorry. And anyway, these guys, they're not freezing, but they're plenty cold. And they didn't bring anything to eat or drink with them. And so they're going around to these reefer setups on the trailers and opening up the coolant system and drinking that water. And they're nearly dead from drinking that water with the coolant additive in it. And so that's the condition we usually saw them in, flat on their backs on the deck. So that it was just it really surprised me. These people, I saw the interview of a bunch of them down on the beach on the far east end of Dominican Republic, and there's a passage between that end of the island and Puerto Rico on the other side, and it's a pretty close gap, but there's a lot of current, there's a lot of weather, and a lot of sharks. And Excuse me. And these television reporters were asking them, why do you want to put a raft in and try to get across the Mona Passage this way when you know there's sharks out there? They say, well, if we stay here, we know we're going to die. We're going to starve to death. And so we're willing to take that chance for that reason. And it was the same way with when I was on the Gus Darnell for Ocean Ship Handling. Ocean Ship Holdings out of Houston. They're still operating over in Houston. In fact, I know a guy that works in their office. He's like a port captain. But anyhow, that's the ship that I was on down there in '94, in the summer of '94 for the Haitian invasion. And we saw a sinking raft down there just off of Cayman Brac. And the AB that spotted it let the mate on watch know, and then they called all hands. And we just did circles, tighter and tighter circles, until all the speed ran out from the ship, and we slowed down finally, and were able to take those guys aboard. They were in a raft. It was homemade. It was sinking, and it was 5 sugarcane farmers from Cuba. And so when they came up the accommodation ladder, I was there at the top. I reached down and grabbed one by the hand, and then I put my other hand on his shoulder, and it felt like I was pulling a skeleton on board. And these guys, their clothes were about gone. Everybody pitched in and provided clothing for them, and the stewards department put together a hasty meal of leftovers, and you could tell that it was the best meal that they had ever had in their entire lives. And then they posted us as according to the procedure manual. You know, we did what we were supposed to do. They gave us mace pistols, Smith & Wesson mace pistols, and lead core fiberglass batons, and posted 2 of us at each door where these guys were sleeping. And then when we got close enough to Guantanamo Bay, a Coast Guard boat came out and took them. And then I realized they were just going to turn them back over to the Cubans and repatriate them to Cuba. I felt so bad for those guys. That was the same thing that happened. We got to Santo Domingo one time and had 5 stowaways on the barge, and we rounded them all up, and the port of the Dominican Republic or the government sent out an army boat, and they took those guys back to shore. I felt bad for those guys because I knew they were going to get their butts whipped, and but we couldn't afford to, put that kind of a financial burden on the company just because of what they had done. So that was just routine stuff, that's just the only place we ever went that we didn't have stowaways was Tampico, Mexico, when we were on that carbon black run down there to the tire factory. But Tampico was a whole lot better environment for the citizens of Mexico than any of those other places that we visited. A whole lot better. So anyhow, that's pretty much the story on that stuff. I just, occasionally you hear news stories, like when they sent the hurricane relief aid down there to San Juan, and somehow it got lost. And I know very well that the stories about the corrupt government officials down there are true, because everybody's corrupt down there. And I even shared accommodations on a couple of occasions when I went to the Seafarers Harry Lundberg School of Seamanship at Piney Point that was operated by the Seafarers International Union. I was a member of that union, but I never was a union sympathizer. Those guys, they were on the wrong side of our capitalist way of life. They were just, I mean, the representative in Congress at that time was Barbara Mikulski, who was everything except an avowed communist. And now, of course, Brent Coons is the one for that district. And then, oh, golly, I don't have to mention Uncle Joe is from Maryland also. So that's not nice people up there, not our kind of people. But I really, I can't say enough good about, the people that I worked for. But as far as the way they applied the work rules and the union, that was just regrettable. One time the bosun told me what he wanted me to do. It was a Saturday, and I didn't know what the work rules were. I didn't care. I was out there. I wasn't out there to make money. I was out there for the experience. I was out there to have a good time and learn and do it before I got too old to do it, and seeing the different ways that seamanship is applied in different contexts is an education in itself. And so I'm out there, fulfilling my obligation, and it's a Saturday morning, and the bosun's mate is, or the bosun, he's the department head for the unlicensed deck department. So he's the guy that runs, everybody. He's the boss for the union. And so anyway, this guy tells me to run this spray painting rig out there and paint a header, for cargo. And so I start doing that, and here comes one of the other able-bodied seamen, and he says, "Hey man, get out of my rice bowl." And I said, "What are you talking about, rice bowl?" And he says, "Who told you to spray paint this?" I said, "Well, the bosun told me." And he says, "Well, we're going to go talk to the bosun right now." And he went over there and he talked to that guy. He said, "Hey, why do you have this guy spray painting on a Saturday?" And the bosun was hungover. He didn't even know that it was Saturday. So on Saturdays, you get paid premium no matter what. So nobody's going to do a job that would otherwise pay premium on any day of the week. That's what the whole thing was about. Spray painting pays premium any day of the week. So you don't do it on Saturdays when it pays premium anyway. That's how, so if you never worked on a union job, that's how corrupt this stuff is. It was humorous in a way, but I was just glad to get out of it with my 20 years. And now I'm collecting a nice monthly pension from them. But I'm not their guy. That's all I'm gonna say. I'm just not their guy.
Roger on that, sir. I certainly have not had your perspective or experiences on the show here yet.
Oh, well.
So I really appreciate you hopping on kind of short notice here this evening.
Oh, well, I'm just waiting around for the 21st. And when they inject that little pellet of testosterone under my skin, I'm hoping for big results, and I'm hoping to return to the rivers as soon after that happens as I possibly can make it. I'll be hitting the gym every single day, as long as, as long as I'm able to move into it, and I know that's the way to keep from getting too sore, because I was a jock in high school. So, I'll be doing the same routine, trying to get back into better shape. But there you go.
I do wish you all the best next week, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. And I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. We'll be in touch.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.